Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the contactless passenger journey using biometrics. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam Leighton. I am the Regional Airports Manager and Industry Development Manager at the AAA. Today's webinar will cover the increasing confidence, reliability and accuracy of identity authentication and verification using biometrics. What does the future hold for biometrics in the airport environment? How using a passenger's mobile device enables off-airport processing to facilitate a seamless and contactless flow on airport. How collaboration between airports, airlines and government border agencies is critical to ensure a true end-to-end biometric passenger journey, and the introduction to the only operational terminal-wide biometric passenger journey in the world at Singapore's Changi Airport Terminal 4. As always, the opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. I'm now going to show you a screenshot of your attendee control panel. You can see in the GoToWebinar control panel the questions chat section. You can click into that section and submit any questions you may have at any time throughout the presentation. We will answer these questions at the conclusion. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenters, Xavier Assad, Country MD and Vice President Oceania, Public Security and Identity from IDEMIA, and Pete Smith, BDM, Borders and Airports, Public Security and Identity at IDEMIA. Xavier's tenure with IDEMIA started in 2010 as General Manager for Programs, which included both facial recognition, smart gate programs in Australia and New Zealand. With his hands-on leadership style, Xavier drove the establishment of a professional local capability, including Lab for Innovation Technologies and go-to markets, critical to the company's future in the region. He has developed a strategic vision and is directly driving execution on the use of biometrics in the Australian and airline ecosystem. Pete is new to IDEMIA 2020. He's well known in the wider aviation community as an expert in airport and airline operations. With his expertise, Pete is able to consult, advise and assist customers with specific technologies and show the positive impact they can have not only on the passenger experience, but also the value today's and tomorrow's technology bring to a business. These presentations take time to prepare, and I'd like to thank Xavier and Pete for preparing for today's webinar. Welcome you both, and please enjoy the webinar, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sam, and thanks to the AAA for not only giving us the opportunity to share with you all today, but of course for continuing to bring these educational webinars to AAA members throughout the year, particularly despite all the challenges that we're facing. And of course, thanks to all the attendees for taking time out of your busy schedules to be virtually here with us today. Both Xavier and I are very pleased to be here to share with you some of our experiences and expertise surrounding biometrics in the passenger journey. We hope that you're able to take away some new knowledge and insights as we discuss the various topics as we work through this morning. So, biometrics. I'm sure we all have some understanding of what they are. So let's go through some of the basics just in terms of different types, what the purpose of biometrics is, and how the different types compare with each other. So fingerprints and facial recognition. These are probably the two most common responses when the term biometrics is used. There are a number of different forms of biometrics, and they're classified generally into two types, physiological and behavioural. But what's the purpose of biometrics? So regardless of an airport environment, the purpose remains the same, to identify a person and to authenticate a person's identity. And there are clear distinctions between the two of those. So if we look at it in the airport context, let's assume that you have the ability to enroll your biometrics via a mobile app. And bear with me for a little bit on that, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on as we progress through. But throughout this process of enrollment, your identity needs to be authenticated. So are you the person that you're claiming to be? So you take an image of your passport, and the biometric enrollment process extracts that information from the chip of your passport, which just happens to include your biometrics. These biometrics were created, sorry, going on with the screen there. These biometrics were created automatically if you have an e-passport that is, when you applied for your passport, and they were derived from the image that you supplied. So your name and other identifiable information is also checked from your passport, potentially with your booking, to ensure that the correct person is checking in or enrolling in the biometric process. Following this, you take a selfie. This selfie enables a tokenless journey on the airport. Additionally, the information contained within the chip is checked to ensure that it was issued by a trustworthy authority, for example, the Australian government. Both of these processes are authenticating two things. First, you claim that you're the owner of the passport, and it authenticates the live selfie image of you against the passport data. And secondly, you claim the passport is not a fake or a fraudulent one. So the information within the chip is checked to ensure that it's legitimate. So that's a brief summary, I guess, of the authentication part. The other purpose then is to identify. So let's assume you've turned up to the airport having enrolled your biometrics through that mobile phone process before arriving. You get to the self bag drop to drop off your luggage, but without having scanned your passport or your boarding pass, the bag drop doesn't know who it is standing in front of the device that is wanting to drop off their bag, so it needs to identify you. It takes an image of your face and checks against a database of enrolled travellers for that day in order to identify who you are. Once the match is complete, you're identified, and the bag drop knows who you are with a level of certainty. So it's a fairly simple explanation of what the main purposes of biometrics are in an airport context. There is, of course, much more to it, and we'll discuss that throughout the session in a little bit more detail. But on the slide that's displaying there, you can see on the left-hand side that the four most common types of biometrics: face, fingerprint, iris, and voice. Each of these have their own positives and negatives in terms of security and user experience, which is one of the most important items to consider when thinking about which biometric is the most appropriate for your objective or for your use case. Accuracy is important, but when we think about this in the context of an airport again, you also want to ensure that the use of the biometrics is fairly easy and that passengers will adopt it without too much of an issue. So the balance between all of these are critical to ensure that you get the best outcome, both in terms of security and the passenger experience. Voice, for example, in an airport environment, not necessarily easy to use given the background noise, although technology is certainly advancing at a rapid pace, but this likely won't be too much of an issue into the future. Iris, highly accurate. However, it does feel a little more personal than your voice or your face, for example. Given the accuracy of an iris, it's becoming increasingly popular. At the moment, it takes around 1 or 2 extra seconds to capture an iris. However, as technology continues to advance, this capture is getting faster and will soon likely align with a facial capture. Similar for fingerprints, around the accuracy, it's certainly a plus. However, again, it feels a little more personal than other forms of biometrics, and it also adds that touch factor. Face, on the other hand, it's still highly accurate, but also very easy to use, and generally speaking, passengers are quite comfortable adopting it. Additionally, face is quite common for an airport or a border environment because there's already a reference to match against from your passport. Whereas with other types of biometrics, a reference or a single source of truth to match against is not as readily available. Apart from perhaps fingerprints, of course, with the ability to search a criminal database. Hence, fingerprints are quite commonly used in the border context. So when we say accurate or accuracy, how exactly is that measured and what does that mean? Typically, there are 2 key metrics to measure the accuracy and performance of biometrics. And just to be clear, I'll be talking about authentication primarily using facial biometrics in this particular instance. The false acceptance rate, or FAR, which is commonly referred to, is the percentage of times when a person is accepted when they should have been rejected. So it represents a security risk. For example, if I was accepted when trying to pass as someone else. The other key metric is the false rejection rate, or the FRR, which is the percentage of times in which a person is rejected when they should have in fact been accepted. And that represents the efficiency of the system. For example, if I was rejected when trying to pass as myself. Now, when one of these measurable performances increase, the other decreases. So there's a trade-off between the two. FAR generally reflects the level of risk that you're willing to accept, and the FRR reflects the amount of exceptions that will require manual processing, which of course affects operations and the user experience. Getting the right balance between risk and efficiency is a tricky task, and it's generally determined by the use case. So for example, a higher security level or a higher FAR, meaning you require a more stringent threshold when matching. It's generally used when it's imperative that you do not falsely accept a person, such as for border control. Whereas to open a home utility account, for example, power or gas, or even enter an airport lounge, you could generally accept a higher level of risk, as the consequences of getting that identity verification wrong would only have minor or moderate consequences. Now, in the border context, it's quite common to see an FAR of below 0.5%, resulting in an exception rate or an FRR around, say, 1%. In an airport passenger facilitation context, though, you could expect that a higher level of risk could be acceptable because the consequences of a false acceptance are only commercial in nature. And so accepting a higher FAR would result in a lower number of manual exceptions. So with those percentages in mind, you can somewhat understand the achievable accuracy of identity verification using face biometrics with a proven, reputable and high quality end-to-end solution. There are many considerations to take into account when measuring the performance, and it does come down to that quality of the end-to-end chain. So this includes the initial capture. So if we think back to the mobile check-in and enrolment that I mentioned a little bit earlier, this would then be dependent on the mobile phone that the passenger is using for that initial capture. In addition, all subsequent capture devices, and of course, the matching algorithm. Achieving an operationally viable trade-off between that FAR and FRR using facial recognition currently requires a quality system and a quality biometric provider. So the key messages here are that the risks of a false acceptance must be clearly established in order to determine the right balance between that risk and efficiency for a specific use case. A high quality end-to-end system results in a better operational performance. And of course, that's what matters, particularly for your airline partners and for your passengers. So if we turn back time to around, I don't know, let's say 10 years ago, most of us would have considered biometrics to be used in a law enforcement environment, and specifically would have thought of fingerprints when biometrics was mentioned. So if you committed a crime, for example, the police would take and store your fingerprints. These could then be used to confirm your identity, perhaps if you're arrested at a later stage, or used to determine if you're at a crime scene, all that CSI type stuff. But since then, we can thank mobile phone manufacturers, and in Australia, we can thank the Australian SmartGate Border Program for bringing biometric identification into our lives. It became commonplace for fingerprint authentication on smartphones with the launch of the iPhone 5S, if anyone remembers that, back in 2013. It was actually 2 years earlier when Android released the Face Unlock, although the performance of that was quite subpar at the time, given the early stages of development for facial recognition. And of course, then due to that, the uptake was quite minimal. But if you fast forward to 2020, most of us now unlock our phones, our tablets, and our laptops with our face. We pay using our face, in some instances through Apple Pay or Android Pay. We cross international borders using our face and fingerprints or iris in some countries around the world. And we can perform government service transactions, banking transactions, and identity checks through the internet using our faces and digital identity applications that capture identity documents and authenticate them. The use of biometrics today, for most of us, is almost done unconsciously. The comfort and confidence levels with the use of biometrics, they continue to rise, and technology continues to advance at a rapid pace. We expect that the use of biometrics and digital identities will become even more commonplace in the next 5 to 10 years. Governments are investing heavily in these areas, as are private enterprise. Particularly now, given the impact of COVID-19, this has created an even greater importance on the use of digital forms of payment, digital forms of identity, touchless solutions, all to reduce the potential spread of viruses. One thing that can stop a large uptake, though, of a biometric solution is data privacy and trust. So data privacy, it's one of, if not the most important aspect to consider when designing a biometric solution. Passengers should be in control of their data at all times, meaning they must be required to explicitly consent and have the ability to easily opt out. They must be able to determine and understand what data is being collected and what it's being used for, or who it's being shared with. Passenger consent to the use of their data for the purposes that you will use it for must be received prior to a passenger providing any form of personal data. It's important to be a champion of privacy. This then reflects on your organisation's level of trust to the general public. If you can ensure that passengers' data is safe, it's being used appropriately, it's being used only in the ways in which the passenger has provided consent for, and a passenger can opt out or have their data deleted at any time, passengers are more likely to be willing to participate in that program and share their personal data, which of course then in the end, it's of benefit to their travel journeys. Data trust in a number of areas within Australia isn't all that great, and there is certainly a sliding downward scale for data trust in other parts of the world, as I'm sure we can all imagine. As I mentioned on the previous slide, most of us are using biometrics to unlock our phones, for example, and conduct many other tasks in our lives. But again, a lot of this is done unconsciously to the point where we don't really think or feel like we're providing or using our personal biometric data to unlock our phones. It doesn't seem intrusive. Plus, we're asked to consent to this. The data remains in our pockets, and we have the ability to turn off the feature at any time. These same principles can and should be applied to an airport's biometric journey. For example, prior to an implementation, significant promotion of the program should be conducted. This, of course, can be done in many different ways, and most airports already conduct significant amounts of community engagement, particularly for some of the larger infrastructure programs. For example, Brisbane's new runway or Melbourne's planned new runway, and of course the new Western Sydney Airport. All of these projects involved and continue to involve community engagement, being transparent with the general public on what the project involves, the impacts to their daily lives, and of course the benefits to their travel. The same approach should then be taken with the introduction of biometrics. Social media is a great way to get messages out to large audiences nowadays. Reviews and republications of your privacy policies on your websites, information notices put up around the airport, electronic messaging through your airline partners. There's a multitude of ways to get the message out there that you are serious about data privacy, serious about passengers' personal data, and serious about improving their experience at your airports. Clear statements on how their biometric data is being collected, how it's being used, and of course including the significant efficiencies and benefits that it will provide for them, who their data is being shared with, for example, other airlines or border agencies, or even other airports, and how a passenger, of course, can opt out if they wish to. Perhaps a passenger's biometric data is destroyed once their flight departs. Perhaps their biometric data can be stored on their boarding pass, meaning the passenger remains in complete control of their data at all times. Or perhaps it's stored on their mobile phone and not within airport or airline IT infrastructure. There are options and possibilities. Sorry, it's gone again. Assuming everyone can see it again. There are options and possibilities. Yep, sorry. Okay, sorry, I've just lost my spot here for a second. All of the options and possibilities, which I'm sure we all have an idea of, they all have their own positives and negatives. Now, the objective is to ensure that passengers are fully aware, they've consented to, and are comfortable with the collection of their biometric data. Now, specific use of their data, of course, and any sharing of their data to relevant stakeholders. And of course, cybersecurity, to ensure protection of passengers' personal data against any possible breaches. And I'm sure this is already a key consideration today, regardless of biometrics or not. However, biometrics are seen as much more personal information, particularly than that of a name and an email address, for example. What you don't want to be creating is a gold mine of information for cyber criminals. There are, of course, legal implications when implementing a biometric solution, and by no means do I want this to scare any of you away from it. But you will need to complete a privacy impact assessment, conduct ongoing compliance activities, etc. It's not really anything new to what airports are already required to do within other areas of their operations. It's important, however, to understand that it is the way in which you handle personal data and how that impacts the image of your airport or your airline. You don't want to be seen as a big brother, and there are certainly ways to ensure that this doesn't occur. Not only does this impact your image, but can also impact on the uptake of biometrics in your airport to some extent. Now, the key message here is to ensure that you remain responsible with biometric data, and if you are a champion of privacy throughout the whole process, you'll be externally viewed in that way, and your airport, its passengers and partners will be all the better for it. So I've touched a little bit on the basics in terms of what the purpose of biometrics is, the most common types, how performance is measured, confidence in using biometrics, and of course, data privacy. So let's take a look now at what some of the possibilities are for the use of biometrics within airports into the future. Now, as we know, our industry is facing its biggest ever challenge in COVID-19. This is causing a lot of focus to be placed on particular areas, but of course I'd like to focus on the fact that it's putting a lot of focus on re-engineering the passenger journey. Now, I recall only a few months ago when I was talking to airports around the country about ways in which to move an ever-increasing number of passengers and aircraft around the airport more efficiently and safely. Now, although the landscape has changed significantly since then, when you think about it, the question and the problem ultimately remains the same. How can we move passengers through their journey more efficiently? But now, of course, there are added complexities to this. How can we reduce queues and wait times to ensure we don't have many hundreds of people congregating and waiting in a departure hall? How can we recreate the passenger journey by moving some of the typical on-airport processes off-airport? How can we reduce the amount of physical touch points and physical interactions with staff, but still provide the same, if not a higher level of service? And of course, in amongst all of this, how can we maintain the highest level of security and convenience for travellers to ensure that they are confident and comfortable coming back into our airports and onto our aircraft to start travelling again? What we're seeing and hearing around the world is that passengers, first and foremost, have low confidence, both economically and in a health sense. Passengers are wanting a reduction of physical touch and interactions with both people and devices. And this isn't just limited to the airport environment. They have infection spread concerns. The majority of the general public are avoiding large gatherings of people, particularly indoors. So given all of this, including the fact a more low touch or a contactless journey is of importance to passengers, will we see less reliance on kiosks post this pandemic? What we are noticing, and expect will continue to be the case, is that mobile or digital ID is becoming increasingly attractive. There are multiple benefits to a mobile or digital ID. I'm sure some of you would be aware of the DTC, or the Digital Travel Credential Initiative, being run by ICAO. We expect that this initiative, as well as others that may not be to the extent of the DTC, such as identity verification for a mobile app, will become increasingly common, and airports and airlines alike will have a keen interest in researching and developing these solutions with a view to implementing them in the short to medium term. There were already drivers for these initiatives prior to COVID. However, COVID has now added that additional challenge that we all must face and work through in order to bring passengers back through the doors. So how can we minimise the number of physical touch points and staff interactions for passengers on the airport, yet still maintain that same level of security, particularly in terms of identity security? So if I could describe this in two words, and I'm sure you've heard these two words many, many times before, it would be digital transformation. Now, it's a buzzword that's been around for quite some years now, and it extends into many different areas of an airport or an airline's operation. But one part of that digital transformation that hasn't been a key discussion point, particularly here in Australia in recent years, is biometrics. We have the ability to identify and authenticate a passenger whilst they sit on their couch at home prior to arriving at the airport. What happens behind the scenes for that to occur can get rather technical, so I won't go into that just now. But for simplicity, most of us check in for our flights on our mobile phones nowadays. It's a simple and relatively painless exercise. Adding a couple of simple extra steps to this process, such as taking a selfie or holding your phone up against your e-passport to enable a chip read, ensures a passenger is identified and that their identity is authenticated before they even arrive at the airport for departure. This automatically removes one interaction. So how can we reduce queues and wait times, which then of course can unclog departure halls? By moving this one interaction off airport will partially assist with that. And then what if that passenger's identity is then shared with other airport systems and touchpoints, such as bag drop or aviation security lanes? Meaning a passenger doesn't need to physically show their passport or boarding pass to a staff member as they progress through the various touchpoints. Instead, biometric capture devices or cameras are placed at touchpoints where a passenger's identity is required to be provided and confirmed. Then passengers only need to show their face and nothing else. This could remove some of the issues we see, particularly at bag drop areas or security lanes, when a passenger can't seem to find their passport or their boarding pass and takes what seems like forever to find it, particularly if you're the person waiting behind them. So to allow these initial efficiencies to occur just in that departure hall area, they've been enabled by a passenger being able to identify themselves digitally off the airport through a process that already exists. And by having their identity confirmed and authenticated, and then checked automatically at touch points as they proceed through their journey on the airport, we're able to maintain that highest level of security whilst also providing significant convenience for the passenger. And of course then, by reducing the number of physical touch points or staff interactions through the airport, this could assist in a reduction of possible instances in which a virus could be transmitted, given we're in the situation we're in today, allowing passengers to feel more confident that travelling is safe and their risk of catching a virus is limited. What is also an important consideration, understanding how the new passenger behaves. So we all know or have an idea of what the majority of passengers like or dislike or how they behave today. There has been a bunch of research done over a number of decades to try to perfect the passenger experience. But that was before, and it's all about to change. Unfortunately, it's a forced change, but regardless, we'll need to relearn what passengers like or don't like, how they behave, particularly with the introduction or removal of certain services within the airport. This challenge can be combated with some analytical data. Now, biometric implementation can unlock certain data that may not be available today. This could include how many passengers are using a specific touchpoint, how many passengers are moving through a particular touchpoint or area of the airport during peak or off-peak, enabling more efficient staffing to occur perhaps. How long a passenger journey actually takes from the moment they enter the airport to the moment they arrive at their boarding gate, or more easily locating passengers that fail to board. Now, this type of data and analytical functionality can give you the ability to have a clearer and more accurate understanding of how the typical passenger is behaving or conducting their journey, both on the airport and off the airport, and how that compares to what it used to be, which then enables you to be flexible, adapt to change, and adjust your operation to suit the new normal. So where do we sit today in terms of biometric implementations at Australian airports? Border control using the SmartGate program for departures and arrivals is currently the only touchpoint that uses biometrics. But where do we see implementations occurring into the future? Mobile check-in, as I've just described in the last slide, and we'll touch on a little bit more shortly. Electronic declarations for international arrivals, We've conducted a proof of concept for this type of solution, which actually allows for the removal of that paper-based customs declaration card that we all love filling out, and instead completing that declaration on a mobile app or a website link that is then shared with customs for your arrival and is linked to your identity, meaning your face can not only be your boarding pass, but it can also be your customs declaration. Biometrically enabled bag drops and kiosks, security lanes, airline lounges, and boarding. All of these somewhat expand on that initial mobile check-in process, allowing identification and biometric enrolment to occur through the already existing mobile check-in process, can allow passengers to use their face as their boarding pass and identity when dropping off their luggage, passing through aviation security, crossing the border through immigration, entering and exiting an airline lounge, and of course, boarding the aircraft. And that's just enabling the seamless experience on the airport. Then if we look a little further at passenger touch points that form part of their overall travel journey, but are actually outside of the physical airport environment. For airport car parks, for example, nowadays you can enter using your credit cards or push a button to get a ticket. But what if during your airline check-in, your biometric enrolment enabled you to simply show your face at the airport car park for entry? Or for car hire, again, we spend many minutes confirming our identities, and rightly so, when collecting a hire car. But what if that identity verification you did during your airline check-in was used for your car hire booking, and upon arrival to pick up your keys, all you simply had to do was show your face? A similar situation with hotels. Having to show your passport when checking in, registering your details, etc. This can take quite some minutes and creates queues, which then of course creates the potential for large numbers of people in close proximity in an indoors environment. Again, your biometric enrolment that you completed during your airline check-in could be used with your hotel, so that upon arrival, you simply show your face and your room key is provided to you. Or better yet, and this might sound like I'm dreaming, what if upon completion of your new airline check-in, this then allowed you to download your car and hotel room keys onto your mobile phone? Now, the technology already exists for this to actually happen today, believe it or not. Other areas that I haven't included on this slide that could be a possibility into the future. If you look at tourism or travel in general, there are multiple other areas that could benefit from the use of biometrics. Tour activities, concerts, sporting events, all of the things we love to do when we go on holidays. What if we could simply use our face to gain entry to attractions, enter stadiums or concerts, rather than having to interact with a person or a device and produce a form of identity or a ticket, when this can be done in a much more efficient way? Now, it may sound a little scary, and fair enough, the sharing of your personal data with all these other entities. But when you think about it, you're already providing your personal data to each of them, but you're doing that individually today. If done responsibly, for instance, ensuring personal data is used responsibly and for the purposes in which a passenger consents to, as well as allowing the passengers to be in full control of their personal biometric data at all times, it isn't so scary then. In fact, none of this would be possible if we didn't ensure those things, because it's about passengers and customers feeling safe, feeling confident and comfortable providing you with their personal biometric data to share with other travel and tourism providers. This type of data usage in the future won't be possible if we don't take data usage and privacy seriously and allow it to remain controlled by the owner of that personal data. For me, I'd love to see this type of a future become reality. And generally, the biggest resistance is from those that are concerned about privacy and around how personal data is being used or how it's being exploited. So if it's used responsibly, then perhaps in 5 or 10 years, it may become a reality. With all of these possibilities, they can create a much happier and efficient passenger and customer experience. Why? Well, there's less hassle, there's less queuing, there's less physical interactions with people or devices. And not to mention the cost savings for airports, airlines, hotels, etc., having a more streamlined approach to passenger and customer facilitation. So I mentioned digital transformation and particularly the use of mobile check-in as a way to identify and authenticate a passenger. So now let's go through a little bit more detail around how that off-airport and on-airport digital experience could occur. So an important point to make around mobile ID and biometric enrolment is that this is the enabler to a truly contactless passenger journey on the airport. And without it, there would need to be a dedicated on-airport enrolment kiosk, for example, in order to identify, authenticate, and enroll a passenger's biometrics for subsequent touchpoint usage. Now, to streamline this process and take things off the airport, where a passenger is in the comfort of their own home and not having to wait around in an airport departure hall to use a kiosk just to enrol their biometrics, a mobile ID and enrolment comes into play. You'll realise and possibly have already noticed that this process would occur during an airline's flight check-in, meaning this application or process would need to be integrated into the operating airline's mobile application. There are other options, such as a dedicated airport app that airlines redirect to during their online check-in process. However, after many discussions we've had with airlines and airports around the world, we understand the most efficient way is to integrate this process into an airline's check-in application. This ensures that the airline owns their passenger information throughout the whole journey, and additionally, the airline check-in process already exists. We don't want to or need to add a completely new process or task to a passenger's journey. So we start off the airport where the passenger is checking in for their flight on their mobile device. During this process, the passenger is prompted and asked if they wish to authenticate their identity and enrol their biometrics to enable a seamless and contactless on-airport experience. The passenger is shown the details in respect to what data is being collected, who it's shared with, and what it's used for. They are then explicitly asked for consent. Once that consent is received, prompts are displayed for the passenger to follow. These involve taking an image of their passport, which may include that chip read of an e-passport. Then they're directed to take a selfie, which we know a number of passengers wouldn't be opposed to doing. Once the document authentication and selfie match to that passport image is complete, their biometrics are enrolled for use at the airport. Essentially now, the passenger only needs to show their face at any biometrically enabled touch points as their identity and as their boarding pass. To assist in moving processes off the airport, one of the tasks on the airport that can create queues and requires physical interactions with devices or people is bag tag printing. So we suspect that there is a possibility that dedicated bag tag kiosks, meaning the only task that the kiosk is required to do is retrieve a booking and print the required number of bag tags associated with that booking, could become commonplace at various locations off the airport. This could include hotels, airport car parks, train stations, central city locations, amongst others, I'm sure. This would enable a passenger to be completely ready to walk into the airport, drop their bag off without having to line up to use a kiosk to print bag tags, and subsequently proceed directly to security, bypassing some of the biggest pain points on the airport. And from that moment they are on the airport, they're able to use their face as their passport and boarding pass at any biometrically enabled touchpoint, which creates a truly seamless and contactless passenger journey, which all begins with the mobile identity and that biometric enrolment. I'll hand over to Xavier now, who will discuss some of the key considerations to take into account when beginning a biometrics project, including the importance of multi-stakeholder collaboration, some key factors to ensure the successful delivery and implementation, as well as some lessons learned from projects that we've been involved in over time. So Xavier, over to you.
Thanks, Pete. All right, I'm going to talk to you about the delivery of an airport biometric capability. So I apologize in advance, it will get a little bit detailed. I don't know if you can see the next slide. Pete, I don't know if you've handed over the control to me. Otherwise, can you please move to the next slide?
Try now, you should have control. No? Yep, there we go.
Here it comes. All right. So please don't get upset if you don't see your own logo on the diagram there. It's really just for illustration purposes. let me start by talking about the ecosystem. You're quite used to your projects involving a fairly large range of stakeholders. It's kind of the nature of the airport ecosystem. But an airport biometric project is as multi-stakeholder as they come. It involves at least one operator, airport operator, obviously, and that's multiple groups within the airport. Some of the key airlines servicing that airport, one or several airport IT vendors, at least one identity and biometric vendor. There's likely to be some physical infrastructure work as well. In Australia, you'll probably engage with Home Affairs if you ever want to integrate with their process or to leverage their capability. And potentially a range of international partners, such as a partner airport, etc. So a fairly large range of stakeholders for the project. Now, over the recent years, I've seen some very ambitious visions and strategic plans being put together for the implementation of biometrics. It's being seen as a major disruptor of the travel industry, which could redefine the demarcation lines between categories of players. And to some extent, it is, but not in such an immediate kind of manner. So, for example, I've seen airports wanting to take direct ownership of the relationship with the passengers, which is not going to please the airlines, or airlines wanting to dictate airport strategy, which is a classic and does not go down too well with the airports, obviously, or airports wanting to operate border control on behalf of border force, etc., etc. And these tensions will remain. I'm not saying you should forget about them. You need to be conscious of them. And some changes in these demarcation lines will progressively eventuate. But the truth is, you won't succeed with a biometrics project if you antagonize any of these key partners. Fundamentally, we need each other to succeed. So collaboration is going to be truly essential for a biometric project. Your identity management platform, it will need to integrate with the CUS and Qt platforms. For those who don't know what it is, CUS is the common use platform behind the self-service kiosks and backdrops, and Qt is the self-service platform behind the counters manned by airline staff, for instance, at check-in or boarding. So the identity management platform will also need to integrate with your existing hardware, your self-service hardware, the kiosks, etc., with the AODB and other airport systems, with the airline systems, into their business processes, etc., etc. So the point is, you just can't go it alone, okay? And from a supply chain perspective as well, you have the same kind of tensions. And that's true whatever sourcing strategy you use. The key thing to remember is biometrics and identity require their own set of specialist skills and the technologies that go with it. It's not a commodity yet, and it won't be for years to come. So even if you use a prime vendor not far in the supply chain, there will be an identity and biometric specialist, and the whole vendor ecosystem will have to collaborate. Biometrics technologies also have their own operational lifespan. So in the future, you're unlikely to want to change your biometrics and identity provider or your eGate provider at the same time that you will change your Qt provider or your kiosk provider. And that's just because an eGate might last you 7 or 8 years, whereas a Qt workstation might last 3 or 4 years. And so your vendors at some point in time will have to collaborate with other vendors that they're not affiliated with. And in other words, there again, an ability to collaborate across the fragmentation of the supply chain is going to be fundamental. So what are the takeaways of all this? Well, first, here we're trying to summarize a few key success factors. The first thing is, and the most important thing in our opinion, is you'll need to set the ground rules for the collaboration I was talking about just before. And that's both at a governance level and at a technical level. I mentioned getting a couple of airlines on board. They're the primary customers for the capability. So you need to build momentum with a couple of them and get them to contribute to the project. And you will need to involve them in a governance framework so they can have a say. But the airports needs to keep the lead. You want your vendors to work well together as well. So regardless of your sourcing strategy, you should keep control of the rules of engagement between vendors and make your own decisions. You also need to pay very close attention to interoperability. And I can't stress that enough. Why do you need that? Because although you won't need it straight away, you want a solution that can be easily integrated with third parties when it comes to it. Your airlines will want to integrate with other airports, and they can't be locked in with your platform only. Otherwise, they just won't come on board if you impose a proprietary technology or some bespoke development on their end that they can't reuse elsewhere. So at some point in time, you may also want to integrate with Home Affairs and with Museum and Customs or with an overseas airport hub to share information. And you will change your Qt and CUS provider over time and maybe separately change your kiosks and your backdrop appliances, etc. So over the life of the capability, it will have to accommodate integrations with multiple systems. And that's where you need interoperability, so you don't have to replace your platforms just because essentially they're incompatible. So I was saying before, you won't need it straight away because you're likely to want all of the biometric tech to come from one identity and biometric vendor. It's logical to do that just to minimize the risks and to maximize operational performance. But you should make sure that you have interoperability interfaces for third-party integration at all levels. And that's something that you can only evaluate during vendor selection and during the design phase. Otherwise, you'll end up with a potentially significantly locked-in platform. To finish up on collaboration, just highlighting one last point. You have to service multiple airlines, and they all have different operational procedures. So getting visibility on these constraints as early as the design phase is important, because you will need to be able to accommodate a variety of business rules. Let me give you an example. For biometric smart boarding, some airlines may want a passenger to be referred for manual processing if their seat has changed, whereas others will just automatically print out a new boarding pass with a seat change. Or they may want to still do a manual face-to-passport check for certain destinations only, etc., etc. So you will need to take into account this flexibility early on in your system. That's it for collaboration. Our second recommendation is to be passenger-centric. And this is not just a generic or casual recommendation. First, your airline won't come on board if your passenger process isn't completely seamless. And some people have learned this the hard way. Second, the success of the capability with passengers is primarily what will appeal to the airlines, although obviously they will also be attracted by the operational savings they might get out of it. But so if you can, you should try and prioritize the use cases that will drive uptake and expand from that, focusing on the passenger experience. I'll just give you an example of Changi Airport for their Terminal 4 project, where they implemented a big biometric capability. Amongst other things, it was a brand new terminal. And the CEO of Changi Airport Group was the one approving every aspect that related to the look and feel of the passenger experience. And I can tell you, by doing that, it kind of guaranteed a fairly high level of focus from his teams on the topic. So I'm not saying you necessarily need to do that, but I'm just talking about the necessity for focusing on passenger centricity. A big part of being a passenger centric in Australia, we believe, is building trust with your passengers around their privacy. Pete already mentioned it, but I'll stress it again. Privacy isn't just a legal compliance issue. It's also a PR and branding / marketing topic, and we see it as a key success factor. Our last recommendation essentially relates to being serious about a project like this. We've seen a lot of biometric trials just for publicity in the last 24 odd months. And there's nothing wrong with publicity, of course. But when in the name of innovation, you end up in production with something clumsy that ends up being decommissioned because it's not workable, you end up with a lot of lost confidence. So if you're going to use an operational capability such as this, you can't skip a proper system integration process. So I won't go into detail of these recommendations. They're pretty self-explanatory and relatively obvious. But the point is that you will need an industrial capability, and that means doing a full inventory of how it will be used by whom, etc., managing the change properly, etc., etc. All right. So now that sums it up for the key challenges and success factors. Now I'd like to give you some insight into what was the first and for over 2 years was the only terminal-wide implementation of a biometric passenger journey in Changi in Singapore. Sorry, let me go back. Yep. So look, in a nutshell, the project went live. It was a brand new terminal that Changi implemented, and it went live in 2017. It was a sizable project of 300 passenger touchpoints covering bag drop, airside access, access control, border crossing, and boarding. Exception management, I'll just mention that one. Exception management was very important. Essentially, Changi wanted to control all of the exceptions on the system, and they had, so part of the capability is having assistant staff roaming the airport floor with a mobile phone in their hand, and they get notified whenever there's an exception on an appliance, so that they can go and assist the traveler. And so it just shows the importance of passenger centricity, and that's something that Changi really did really well. In terms of what drove the project, it was mostly driven by user experience. They wanted a modern user experience, unique user experience, and they had obviously a big part of it was automation to have optimized operating costs. So it's a low operating cost terminal, and faster processing of passengers, which obviously allows for more dwell time in duty free and restaurants, etc. And so it kind of changed the atmosphere of the airport, making it almost an entertainment venue as well as a travel hub. I might just show you now a short video of the passenger process. Erin, if you could launch the video, please. Thank you. So what you will see is a video showing the passenger process as it was implemented back in 2017 from the passenger's perspective. So, as I mentioned, the process starts with biometric enrollment on the self backdrops. So essentially here, we assume that the passenger has already checked in. So she scans her boarding pass instead of her passport and does a facial biometric capture that will match against the face on the passport. From that, a token is created, which is the portrait of the Dai linked to her passport and her boarding pass. Moving on to access control, if she hadn't done this biometric enrollment at the self backdrop, she can do it at the access control point as well. So, and set her passport in that case and shows her face. Then she moves on to border control. In their case, they use thumbprint in Singapore. Although they're trialing now the move to iris in complement of to face, just for accuracy and better user experience. And then she spent some time in duty free, etc., and then moves on to boarding. In this case, she's scanning her boarding pass and then showing her face, and off she goes, she boards. From that moment onwards, essentially her biometrics are destroyed and she boards the aircraft. So Changi Airport are now moving to the activation of tokenless, so in the future she won't even have to scan her boarding pass. This project was really it was a huge public success. CAG are now rolling out biometrics in the other terminals due to the success of this first project. Anyway, it was more of a way to illustrate what we talked about in a more visual kind of manner. This is all real, has been in operation for 2 years, almost 3 years. There's a lot of further innovation, including some specific to COVID-19 that have been developed since then, but we may need to do another webinar on this topic. Anyway, that concludes the presentation. We hope you learned something from this webinar, and we will now take some questions.
Thank you so much, Xavier and Pete, for that presentation. Very interesting. I do have a few questions. We'll only have time for 3. So this is from Chris Hemmings, and he asks that I've recently read that facial recognition is less accurate for people with darker skin tones. What is your experience, understanding of the technology advancements in this regard?
So, facial recognition uses artificial intelligence. Nowadays, all algorithms are using artificial intelligence, and the performance of artificial intelligence depends on the data it was trained on. So if you're using an algorithm that was not trained on people with darker skin, you will have a lower performance on people with darker skin. And so it's been a big, it can be true for any other kind of demographics. It depends on the algorithm. And it's been a strong focus of research among the top players in biometrics to neutralize what's that kind of behavior, which is called bias in artificial intelligence. And so nowadays, it's really not quite as true, although it remains a topic of focus for R&D, but certainly it's not the way it has been depicted in the media, where people think that facial recognition is essentially discriminatory. It's not at all the case. It's a lot more complicated than that, and it's actually less and less of a problem because all the leading players have acknowledged that they needed to work on it. So now it's much less of a concern.
So is that, because I read an article in New Scientist magazine about this very topic not so long ago, and it was more about the data going in terms of teaching the artificial intelligence. So it was more that the data going in was biased, not that the data coming out was biased. Is that right?
Yeah, if you give if you do your machine learning for your artificial intelligence engine using data that was biased indeed, because it lacks the data for particular demographics, for instance. Your algorithm will not be as accurate for this particular kind of demographics. Essentially, that's how it works. Not being as accurate doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be discriminating against, say, in the example of people with darker skin, if you're using an algorithm that is biased against darker skin, what it means is not necessarily that people with darker skin are going to be refused more often. In some cases, it will actually mean that people with darker skin will be accepted more often, and then might actually create a security risk because they accepted on somebody else's identity, for instance. So I guess the point I'm making is bias is not, AI bias is a topic, but it's not what is being depicted in media. And in actual fact, that's why you need to understand your algorithm, and that's why also for the foreseeable future, you need to pay particular attention to using a reputable algorithm from one of the leading vendors.
Excellent, thank you. Our next question is from Dave Race, and he says, compared to a swipe card against a swipe card reader to access restricted areas, i.e. airside access with an ASIC, what would be the additional cost to introduce face recognition?
Oh, that's, it depends.
Feel free to take any of these questions on notice. If you don't have the answer now, I'm happy to, if you want to take it on notice, you can get back to me and I can send that along to Dave if you prefer not to answer now.
Yeah. Look, by all means, we can have a conversation. It really depends on the scope of the project. There's a very wide range of solutions for what he's talking about.
Okay, and then we have Timothy Lyons. Based on your experience and knowledge, how far are we away from an end-to-end single token biometric solution? Is it a realistic expectation that border agencies will integrate, share the necessary data to make this a reality?
Border agencies sharing the data, unlikely. Airports and passengers sharing their data with border agency, that's a lot more likely, and that will eventually come because it's just going to be the pressure of the industry. The border agencies are not going to be able to resist that. But fundamentally, they just need, all the border agencies need to do is be able to trust the data they receive, and there's a number of ways of doing that. But so to answer the first part of the question, which is how realistic is it? It is very much realistic. The full end-to-end integration, not just on departures, but also departures, transit, and arrivals, will only be resolved once the industry really agrees on a number of standards which are currently being worked on for the sharing of that data in a privacy-conscious kind of way. So part of it is the digital travel credential that Pete touched on before. There's a number of other things going on that front, but fundamentally, there needs to be some standards, and I'll have to say, COVID has thrown a bit of a spanner in the works on that front, because everybody wants to accelerate the digitalization and the automation in the airport, and people tend to focus on their own turf. So an airport will look at its own departure process, for instance, as opposed to focus too much on these other longer term kind of topics. So the full end-to-end process, fully integrated, will probably come in a mainstream kind of manner, maybe in the next decade or so. What's more likely to happen in shorter term, and what is accelerating shorter term, is per airport or within a country, for instance.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Xavier. Xavier and Pete, that's all we have time for today. We have run a little bit over time, but some really great questions there from the audience, and I think definitely worthwhile sticking around to answer. So thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time for the presentation today. It's really exciting to hear about this innovation, and it is a nice change from the constant COVID stuff that we keep hearing about. So it's actually nice to see a little bit of innovation and a little bit of positivity as well. So thank you so much. Today's webinar recording will be available in Airport Alert and emailed to everybody who registered and attended today. The AAA is encouraging feedback, not just on this webinar, but on any other topics that you would like to see covered in the 2020 webinar series. You can email Erin at events@airports.asn.au. Once again, thank you everybody for joining. The next webinar in our series is taking place next week, Wednesday. Oh no, sorry, not next week. It's a little bit, I think at the end of the month, sorry. Wednesday, the 30th of September, and that'll be presented by Kirsten Sanford. She is the Senior Standards Officer, Aerodromes and Heliports from CASA, with the topic being MOS 139 Post-Implementation Update. You can register for this event by visiting the AAA website. We are also asking that if members have any questions that they would like to ask CASA about post-implementation or the transition update, that you send those through to me at slayton@airports.asn.au, and then that way we can have a list of questions ready for Kirsten for the end of the webinar. Enjoy the remainder of your afternoon and week. Xavier and Pete, thank you once again. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you online at the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks, appreciate it.